County history. It's a very different kind of set of events that took place on August 16th of 1889. And he's going to tell you about that right now. I'm getting out of his way because we're going to have fun. It's a full house, and y'all are going to be glad you came.
Thank you, Ken. Can everybody hear me okay? Before we begin to talk about this Jaybird-Woodpecker Saga, I have a confession to make. I'm not a scholar on the subject. Instead, I consider myself more as a student who has been asked to present this topic to his class. I based this presentation from material taken from someone who was a scholar on the subject, Pauline Yelderman, who wrote a book entitled The Jaybirds of Fort Bend County, a work that earned her the prestigious Governor's Award for Best Historical Book of 1979. Part of my training as a technical writer is to take apart relatively difficult material and put it back together and present it in a way that suits a particular audience. Needless to say, I found this task challenging. With this all said, let's start by going back 123 years ago, approaching about 6 in the evening on the 16th of August, 1889. You're walking along Morton Street in Richmond, heading from the river to the courthouse. On the left side of the street, you pass by the Brahma Bull and Red Hot Bar. You hear a steady stream of masculine discourse competing with music performed in the street. Near the entrance of this bar, an old, bent-over black man is dancing and singing about the tension hanging over the town. The jaybird flew to the woodpecker's hole. The woodpecker to the jaybird says, "God damn your soul." The jaybird says, "You needn't for to cuss, for I didn't come here to stir up a fuss." The woodpecker says, "I've my doubts." The jaybird says, "I'll make you walk about." You walk further up the street past the National Hotel, the hot afternoon sun burning your face. You wipe the sweat from your brow. You glance around and sense that everybody in Richmond is going about the day as usual. You move further up the street and overhear two men talking. "Did you hear what happened earlier this afternoon?" "No, tell me about it," replied the other. "Old Albert George is locked up tight as a tick in the jail. Deputy Sheriff Mason heard him say he was going to shoot some woodpeckers and took him in." "Well, I'll be," answered the other man. "I heard later that old Red Hot Frost told Will McFarlane to go get George out, but he was so drunk asleep he just left him there." "You don't say." You walk a little farther up the street toward the courthouse and you see a man talking to some women, another man just sitting on his horse, and a little black girl skipping across Morton Street. You know that both sides, the jaybirds and the woodpeckers, have been anticipating a shootout for a long time, that they are determined to settle their political differences, even unto death. But what you don't know is that in the next instant, all hell is about to break loose. But before I tell you what broke loose, let's review what led to the incident. Almost 3 decades earlier, the citizens of Fort Bend County had given their all to the cause of the Confederacy. Very early in the war, Benjamin Franklin Terry tendered his famously brave Terry's Texas Rangers to Confederate President Jeff Davis. Possibly one half of the men from Fort Bend County who served in the Rangers were killed, wounded, or died in prison or from battle-related illnesses. Many other Fort Bend men served in Hood's Brigade and other companies, also suffering heavy casualties. During the war, the women tended the plantations with the help of the slaves. They grew cotton so badly needed by the Confederacy. In their spare time, they held benefits to raise money for the needy families of Fort Bend soldiers and prayed for peace, but only after Confederate victory. These women, too, like their men, were zealous and dedicated to the Southern cause. Their devotion to the Confederacy never waned, even at hearing the news of their dead and wounded. Fort Bend's citizenry held out to the bitter end, even after receiving the news of General Lee's surrender on April 9, 1865. In a mass meeting in Richmond, they made one last defiant gesture. In the meeting, they passed resolutions stating that under no circumstances and in no event would they submit to their dominating and perfidious enemies who had placed an ocean of blood between them, an ocean that could not be crossed or dried. They also urged the 80,000 Confederate soldiers west of the Mississippi to stand firm. They even offered to equip 30,000 Negroes who, with the aid of God, Kirby Smith, and General Magruder, would hold Texas. These resolutions were the last gasp of a brave but conquered people. To their dismay, they finally learned that General Gordon Granger had read the Juneteenth proclamation from the balcony of Ashton Villa in Galveston, freeing all slaves throughout the state. Life as they had known it was no more. But there were other folks in Fort Bend County who rejoiced in the news when it reached their ears. Many slaves, now freed from their masters, flocked to Richmond. Richmond might have been one of the many towns in Texas where the Negroes danced in the streets and sang, "Lincoln rode a big black horse, Davis rode a mule." Lincoln was a nobleman, Davis was a fool. All in all, the stage was set. The incoming months and years, political turmoil and humiliation would paint the Texas landscape. Some have argued that if Lincoln had lived, his policies towards the seceded states might have made their rehabilitation easier. But Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, lost ground to Congress's radical Republicans, who were determined to punish the rebellious states. The radical Republicans, led by Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, enacted policies of military enforced Reconstruction, policies detestable to many people of the county and to the rest of the state. The Confederate states suffered a collective and personal humiliation. The harsh policies of the radical Republicans instigated bad feelings throughout Texas for the next 9 years. It wasn't until 1874 that things started to turn around at the state level when Democrat Richard Coke became governor, ending the radical Republican rule. However, it did not entirely put an end to Republican rule on a local level, especially in Fort Bend, Wharton, Brazoria, Matagorda, Colorado, and Grimes counties, where large plantations existed and Negroes outnumbered whites. From the start, both the planters and the freedmen of Fort Bend County found it difficult to adjust. The planters were behind the 8 ball. They were bankrupt because much of their capital had been in slaves, yet they still needed workers for the labor-intensive crops of cotton, corn, and sugarcane. On the other hand, many freedmen flocked to Richmond, believing the government would feed them and provide them with 40 acres and a mule. To make matters worse for the planters, the freedmen who stayed on the plantations exerted their newfound freedom by refusing to work as hard as they had before, and understandably so, for the planters had no money to pay them. John M. Moore Jr., the grandson of plantation owner Dr. Matt Moore, recalled the plight of the plantation owners. After the slaves were freed, Papa and them had an awful time. Ate pickled pork from barrels, no sugar, no coffee. Made clothes from calico costing $50 per yard. When the slaves were freed, the family was forced to move to town. Before the radical Republicans exerted their power to punish the southern states, Fort Bend's ex-Confederates and ex-secessionists went along with Andrew Johnson's more moderate plan of restoration in the immediate months after the war. They made the most of the situation by going about the business of electing themselves the county government. But when the radical Republicans took over, only one of Fort Bend's elected officials could remain in office. The rest were unable to swear to the oaths now required by the radical Republicans. They couldn't swear absolutely to no involvement in the rebellion or in the secession of Texas. Under radical Republican rule, the military now conducted and enforced elections. And with the aid of the Freedmen's Bureau, Fort Bend County's politics were about to make a major shift in power. Before the war, blacks had outnumbered whites in Fort Bend County by about 2 to 1, but demographics changed. It happened like this. During the war, owners from other southern states sent their slaves to Fort Bend County for safekeeping out of the reach of Union forces. Then, immediately after the war, planters in the nearby counties of Austin, Washington, and Grimes told many of their native Texas freedmen to, quote, get the hell out, adding more blacks to Fort Bend's population. And finally, other freedmen came to Fort Bend County because land prices were so cheap, 50 cents to $1 an acre. So by the end of the 1860s, the black population had grown from 2 to about 3.5 blacks to every white. Anticipating problems, Adjutant General Wood sent federal troops from Galveston to Richmond, the only polling place in the county during the 1869 election. Surprisingly, the election was peaceful except for one disturbance. Nothing so major, however, as to close the polls. As a result, the Negro population was able for the first time to demonstrate its power in Fort Bend County. The outcome of the election turned out pretty much as expected. The Republicans won overwhelmingly. Their victory spawned a sea change in Fort Bend County government that would last for the next 20 years. The Negroes of Fort Bend County had fared very well in the election. The Freedmen's Bureau had tutored them regarding their roles in county politics. Out of 16 county vacancies, 6 were elected to office. More than that, the election launched the political careers of several black men. Most prominent was Walter Burton, who was elected sheriff and tax collector. He was an ex-slave from the Burton plantation on Jones Creek, where he was taught to read and write. The little ditty handed down through the years reflects his successful political career. Mother, mother, may I go to swim? Yes, my darling son, if you hang your clothes on a hickory limb and vote for Walter Burton. He performed his sheriff and tax assessor duties diligently. On top of that, he won the respect of most Fort Bend citizens, both black and white. Later, he was elected to the state senate. Prairie View A&M stands as a testimonial to his efforts to further educate his people. Burton and his son Horace are buried in the all-white Morton Cemetery in Richmond. No one knows why for sure, but you could speculate the citizens of Richmond and Fort Bend wanted to show their respect. Another black man to launch his career was Henry Clay Ferguson. He replaced Walter Burton as sheriff and tax collector in 1873. He had been a slave in Jasper County and moved to Harris County. The Freedmen's Bureau in Houston had promised him a commissioner's position, but he never received it. Instead, he became the secretary of the Harris County School Board. He moved from there to become a police officer to Republican Governor Davis. Then when the Democrats took control of the state government, he came to Fort Bend County. Through the years, other prominent blacks held office as well. Over time, misconceptions have grown concerning the so-called Republican Negro regime that took over Fort Bend government in 1869. Before we get knee-deep into the Jaybird-Woodpecker Saga, I'd like to explain a few things about these misconceptions. First of all, generations following the feud, in general, had mistakenly referred to the regime as the carpetbagger Negro regime. But there is no evidence that any of the white office holders were carpetbaggers. It appears none of Fort Bend's office holders came from the north to profit from the Reconstructing South. They were already longtime Fort Bend residents. Secondly, some have even referred to the Jaybird-Woodpecker feud as a conflict between carpetbaggers and local citizens. But we'll soon see that wasn't true either. In reality, it was a feud mostly among family and friends, just about all having their roots in the local Democratic Party. And lastly, some have overlooked the fact that early on, although there was graft and corruption in county government, respectable blacks such as Burton and Ferguson honorably held offices. Simply, from 1869 to 1889, county government became increasingly corrupt as local whites manipulated the black Republican vote, backing black office holders that they could control. These white men were eventually able to get themselves directly elected to county offices. Two more things that might help before we talk about the feud. I get this question all the time. Who exactly were the Woodpeckers and who were the Jaybirds? The Fort Bend whites we just talked about, who backed the Republican office holders, became the Woodpeckers. They were originally Democrats who pecked their way into the county government by manipulating the black Republican vote. Once they got themselves directly elected, these Woodpeckers managed to hold themselves up in the county courthouse where they were able to practice unbridled graft and corruption. Enter their opponents, the Jaybirds. By the mid-1880s, a group of angry young men in Richmond, led by the older Henry Red Hot Frost, thought enough was enough and would eventually be tagged the Jaybirds because they wanted to chase the corrupt Woodpeckers out of the county government. They felt it was time to rid the county of the, quote, infamous and corrupt courthouse gang, the Woodpeckers. These young men were from the planter class, sons of Fort Bend's first families, from families such as Ragsdale, Bell, Gibson, Blakely, Pearson, McFarlane, and Mitchell. They had been schooled out of the county and were well informed and intelligent. So thus begins our saga. These young men had a great deal of leisure time. They spent much of it in Henry Frost's Brahma Bull and Red Hot Bar at Morton and 2nd Streets. They met almost daily in a room above the saloon. Sometime in 1885, they organized the Rosebud Club. Supposedly, it was a social and literary organization, yet they devoted their meetings almost entirely to county politics, how to get rid of that unholy coalition entrenched in the courthouse. Henry Red Hot Frost was most likely the one who turned their attention to politics. For years, his theme by day and dream by night was to bring honest, decent government to Fort Bend County. Now 40 years old, he was a cool, fearless, and aggressive person with a dynamic personality. When he talked, the younger men listened. They soon looked to him for leadership. Within weeks after organizing, the Rosebud Club became the Young Men's Democratic Club of Richmond. It had about 80 members. By July 1888, it held in Richmond an all-day mass meeting of county Democrats, the first of its kind since the war. In it, they decried the foul county government and its leaders. They even invited old veterans of the Battle of San Jacinto to their rally held at Davis Hall. Some say the rally renewed the youth of the old time. In addition, they honored and revered any old gray-haired Democrats that were present. At one point, Captain P.E. Pearson stepped up to address the crowd, challenging them. He said, quote, "Let's show the world that the Democratic Party of Fort Bend County is at last awakened." But a fly fell into the ointment. Within a few weeks, it became known that not all members who had signed the organization's constitution were going to support the Democrat ticket on the county level. The club debated whether these members were actually true Democrats. Unable to come to a conclusion, about 40 members formed another club. They were claiming to be independent Democrats. They named the organization the Cleveland and Thurman Club after the Democrat national ticket. Ominously, some of the young men maintained memberships in both clubs, supporting both Democrat and Republican candidates.